The morning looked ordinary enough. Sunlight flooded the room, sharp and unforgiving. The heat didn't stop me. One silent notification did. No message, no warning, just a subtle update from the family trust. I waited for the screen to change. It never did. Control hadn't slipped away. It had been taken on purpose. I grew up in a family that looked functional from the outside. There was always a plan, always a hierarchy. Everyone knew where they stood. My father, Richard Collins, liked to say he kept the family together. What he really meant was that he made the final call. Money, decisions, timing, those were his territory. He didn't raise his voice often. He didn't have to. Authority came with his name, and he wore it like a uniform. My sister Lena fit perfectly into that system. She was visible, loud, charismatic. If something went wrong in her life, it became an emergency for everyone else. Bills, deadlines, explanations. There was always a reason it couldn't wait. And then there was me. I wasn't the one people worried about. I was the one people relied on. The person you call after the panic fades. When paperwork needs to be signed and things need to be cleaned up quietly, I signed documents without asking too many questions. I made calls when no one else wanted to. I showed up early, stayed late, and left without being noticed. That became my role early on. Not because anyone asked me directly, but because every system rewards the person who keeps it running. When my father needed a form reviewed, it landed on my desk. When Lena missed a deadline, I fixed it. When something had to be handled discreetly, I was already doing it. No one ever said thank you. They didn't need to. Consistency replaced gratitude. Years passed like that. 10, maybe more. Long enough that the pattern felt normal. I wasn't asked what I wanted to do with my life. I was asked what needed to be done next. There's a difference. In our family, being responsible didn't come with authority. It came with expectation. The more capable you were, the less visible you became. My father talked about legacy, about family values, about sacrifice. He liked words that sounded heavy. They made the structure feel justified. Lena talked about opportunity, about taking risks, about needing support just this once. And I handled the follow-up. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because arguing never changed the outcome. Silence was efficient. Compliance kept things moving. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough. If things didn't fall apart, I was doing my job. If no one was calling in the middle of the night, I had done my part. That's how roles harden into identity. Not through big decisions, but through repetition. At some point, I stopped being Mara, the person. I became Mara, the buffer, the one who absorbed impact so others didn't have to. I didn't notice when that happened. No one ever does. You only notice later, when something breaks and everyone looks at you, waiting for you to fix it again. And that morning, staring at the screen, I realized something uncomfortable. I hadn't been trusted because I was valued. I had been trusted because I was predictable. I had been given responsibility, not ownership, tasks, not choice, access, not authority. The role worked as long as I stayed inside it. As long as I didn't ask who decided where the lines were drawn. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't the life I had chosen. It was the life that had been assigned to me, one signature at a time. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a second. If you've ever been the person who keeps things from falling apart, the one who fixes problems quietly while others take credit. Go ahead and let me know in the comments. And if this story sounds familiar, make sure you're subscribed because this is the part where the pattern starts to break. I didn't fight back when it started. That's the part people misunderstand. They think silence means surrender. They assume if you don't object, you agree. What it actually meant was that I was paying attention. 3 years ago, nothing looked urgent. No alarms, no dramatic confrontations, just small changes that were easy to explain away if you wanted to. An updated statement that arrived a day later than usual. An email forwarded instead of sent directly. A meeting I wasn't invited to, but heard about afterward. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions in the room where answers could be rehearsed. I started saving everything. Emails went into folders labeled by date. Statements were downloaded instead of skimmed. When something changed in the trust, I noted the time, the wording, and who benefited. Not because I suspected betrayal, but because I had learned something important early on. People who talk the most about loyalty rarely document anything. They expect memory to work in their favor. I never raised my voice. I never accused. I never made it emotional. That made them comfortable. When you don't react, people reveal more than they mean to. They assume you're unaware. They assume you're passive. My father liked to explain things to me, not because he wanted my opinion, but because he enjoyed being heard. He'd talk about responsibility, about how hard it was to manage everything, about the pressure of being the one in charge. While he spoke, I listened, not to the justification, but to the details, dates, names, what he emphasized and what he skipped. My sister talked differently. She talked in urgency. Everything was always happening right now. Every decision needed to be made immediately. Every problem was temporary, as long as someone else handled it. I didn't argue with her either. I watched how often her emergencies aligned with quiet transfers and sudden changes. Patterns don't need emotion to be identified. They need time. 6 months went by. Then a year. Nothing exploded, which told me something else. If something can be repeated without consequence, it's not an accident. It's a process. I started treating my own life like an audit, not out of paranoia, out of respect for reality. I kept a ledger, not on paper. In my head first, then on my hard drive. What moved, who authorized it, who benefited, who stayed quiet. Silence gave me distance. Distance gave me clarity, and clarity changes how you see power. The loudest person in the room wasn't the one in control. They were just the one performing. Real control lived in access, in permissions, in what could be changed without discussion. I noticed something else too. No one ever checked whether I was keeping records. They didn't imagine I would. In their minds, my role had already been defined. I was reliable. I was helpful. I was not a threat. That assumption did more work for me than any confrontation ever could. 2 years ago, I realized I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I just needed to let them keep going. Every system eventually documents itself. You just have to be patient enough to let it. I wasn't silent because I was afraid. I was silent because I was learning the rules as they were actually being played. There's a difference between peace and quiet. Peace requires agreement. Quiet just requires patience. I chose quiet. Not once did I say, This feels wrong, because feelings don't stop processes. Records do. And the longer I stayed out of the way, the more consistent the behavior became. Consistency creates evidence. At some point, the silence stopped being passive. It became strategic. I knew exactly what I had. And more importantly, I knew what I didn't need anymore. I didn't need permission. I didn't need validation. I didn't need anyone to admit fault. I just needed the truth to exist somewhere solid. People confuse power with dominance. They're not the same. Dominance is loud. Power is quiet, stored, and patient. By the time anyone realized I wasn't reacting, I wasn't watching anymore. I was ready. Before we move on, let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough for someone to underestimate you, if that sounds familiar? Stay with me, because silence, used correctly, doesn't erase you. It positions you. 2 days before that notification, I had done something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old folder, not the one on my laptop, the physical one. A manila folder that had followed me through 3 apartments and 1 move across county lines, sitting in the back of a closet like a quiet insurance policy. Inside were documents I had signed when I was younger, when I still believed that paperwork was just paperwork, when I thought a signature was a formality, not a weapon. I didn't pull it out because I was dramatic. I pulled it out because something felt organized. And when things start looking organized in a family like mine, it usually means someone is preparing to move money. That night, I made tea. I set the folder on my kitchen table, and I read every line the way you read a contract when you finally realize you're the one paying for it. The next morning, the trust account control was gone. So when people ask me what I did first, the answer isn't I panicked. I logged in again, then again. I didn't hope it would fix itself. I was checking whether the system was consistent. It was. The access permissions were different. The message in the portal was calm, professional, almost polite. Administrative control updated. Authorized under existing agreement. No blood, no shouting, no dramatic theft. Just paperwork doing what paperwork does. And that's the part that makes this kind of betrayal harder to fight, because nothing looks violent on the surface. When you hear the word robbed, you imagine a mask and a weapon. But some of the cleanest thefts happen with a printer and a signature. I didn't call my father right away. Not because I was afraid of him, because I already knew what he would say. He would make it sound reasonable, temporary. For the good of the family, he would wrap the damage in familiar language until it sounded like responsibility. And I didn't want language. I wanted facts. So I started with the only place facts don't care about your last name, the trust portal, the transaction history, the audit log. I clicked through every tab like I was inspecting a crime scene that had been cleaned too well. There was an update entry dated that same morning, a formal note, a list of changes. The words were neutral, but the impact wasn't. Control had been reassigned to a custodian, a temporary administrator, someone who could approve transfers, change allocations, and sign on behalf of the trust. And then I saw the reason. A previously executed asset custody agreement had been reactivated due to anticipated incapacity. Anticipated, not proven, not declared by a doctor, not confirmed by me. Anticipated. That one word told me everything. Because in the world of paperwork, intention can be manufactured. Here's what most people don't understand until it happens to them. When legal documents get involved, the argument stops being emotional. You're no longer fighting what someone did. You're fighting what the system allows them to do. And the system doesn't care that they're your family. A document signed 10 years ago doesn't expire just because you've grown up. It doesn't dissolve because you're doing well now. It doesn't disappear because they would never. It sits there, waiting. I signed that agreement during a chaotic year. A year when everything felt unstable, when my father was handling things, when I was trying to be helpful and not be a problem. It was presented like a safety measure, just in case, just for emergencies, just to keep things smooth. Those words should come with warnings, because smooth for them often means silent for you. And once a paper like that exists, your intentions stop mattering. It doesn't matter that you signed it out of trust. It doesn't matter that you thought it meant one thing. If it's broad enough, it can be interpreted in ways you never imagined. That's the trap. The trap isn't that you were careless. The trap is that families like mine know exactly when to ask for your signature. They ask when you're tired, when you're scared, when you're trying to prove you're loyal. When you think signing will make the tension go away, they don't need to break into your life. They just need you to hand them the keys years in advance. And then, one day, they turn the lock and act surprised that you're upset. I called the trust office that afternoon, not to accuse, to ask a simple question. What triggered the agreement? The woman on the phone didn't sound cruel. She sounded trained. She said, "Ma'am, the document is valid and the request was processed according to procedure." Procedure. That word is another kind of silence. Procedure means there's no villain to yell at, just steps that were followed. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach go cold. No one had to break the law to take my control. They just had to use the law the way it was written. That's why these situations become nightmares. Because the moment you argue, you're already behind. You're not trying to prove someone is wrong. You're trying to prove the system was used wrong, and the burden shifts onto you. You have to show coercion, misrepresentation, bad faith. You have to dig up timelines, signatures, communication. You have to fight with evidence, not outrage. Meanwhile, they get to hide behind calm sentences and stamped forms. That's when I finally did what I should have done first. I opened my saved folder of emails. I pulled up the statements. I compared dates. I didn't ask. Why would they do this? I asked. What did they need this for? Because people don't reactivate legal authority over you for fun. They do it because they're cornered. And if you're listening to this and thinking, that could never happen to me, let me ask you something. Have you ever signed something because someone you love told you it was no big deal? If you have, stay with me. Because the next part isn't about feelings. It's about what those papers were designed to do once you stopped paying attention. That night, after I got off the phone with the trust office, I did the most ordinary thing in the world. I washed a single plate, not because it needed to be washed, because my hands needed something to do that didn't fall apart when I touched it. The faucet squeaked. The water came out warm, then hot. The kitchen light flickered like it was thinking about giving up. I stood there long enough for the house to feel quiet again. And that's when it hit me. Not the paperwork, not the transfers, not the fact that someone had moved control out from under me with a few clicks. The real Udar was simpler. If I collapsed right then, if I sat on the floor and couldn't get back up, no one in my family would rush to me because they were worried. They would rush to me because they needed information. What did she see? Who did she call? What did she save? What did she sign? That's the difference between being loved and being used. Love shows up when you're broken. Use shows up when you're useful. I didn't cry. I didn't have the kind of shock that looks dramatic on camera. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of realizing the home you've been protecting for years is not a place you can rest. It's a job you can never clock out of. I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the wall where the sun left a bright rectangle on the paint. The light in that rectangle was almost cruel, like the world was saying, "Everything is fine." But my mind had already moved to a different truth. For most of my life, I believed that if I just did enough, helped enough, fixed enough, stayed calm enough, there would be a moment where the family finally felt safe, like I'd earn it. What I hadn't considered was this. You can't earn safety in a system that profits from your instability. You can't prove yourself to people who only keep you around because you're predictable. And in that moment, I stopped asking the question I'd been trained to ask. What did I do wrong? I replaced it with a better one. Why am I paying for problems I didn't create? That question didn't make me angry. It made me clear. I realized I wasn't grieving money. I was grieving an illusion. The illusion that there was a place I could go where I didn't have to be strong. A place where I could be the one who's cared for, not the one who keeps everything from collapsing. And once you see that illusion for what it is, you can't unsee it. Because after that, every "Are you okay?" sounds like a check-in on your usefulness. Every "We're family" sounds like a claim. Every "Just trust me" sounds like a contract you didn't agree to. I rinsed my hands, dried them on a towel, and turned off the kitchen light. Then I opened my laptop again. Not because I felt powerful, because I finally understood what I was dealing with. And I knew I couldn't afford to pretend it was a misunderstanding any longer. 3 days later, I sat across from Daniel Price in a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee that had been reheated too many times. He didn't ask me how I was doing. He asked me to hand over everything I had, emails, statements, the agreement. I slid the folder across the table. He didn't react. He just nodded, the way people do when they're already a few steps ahead of you. For a while, the only sound in the room was paper moving, pages turning, a pen tapping once, then stopping. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "This isn't favoritism." He didn't say it gently. He said it like a diagnosis. I waited for him to explain. He leaned back and pointed to a line on one of the documents. "This," he said, "is damage control." That was the moment the story changed. Up until then, I thought this was about hierarchy, about my father choosing one child over another, about loyalty and control and old family patterns. But Daniel wasn't interested in psychology. He was interested in motive. He started laying things out in a way that felt almost mechanical. The trust hadn't just been accessed, it had been restructured, not in a way that benefited the family long-term, in a way that created short-term liquidity, fast, quiet, specific. He pulled up a timeline on his tablet. Transfers lined up with missed payments. Reallocations coincided with deadlines that had nothing to do with me, and then he said my sister's name. Not accusing, just factual. Lena had outstanding obligations. On paper, they looked manageable. In reality, they were compounding, bad investments, personal guarantees, things that don't show up in family conversations, but light up legal dashboards. She was exposed, Daniel said, and someone decided to cover it. That someone wasn't subtle. My father hadn't stepped in to help her because she was the favorite. He had stepped in because the fallout would have reached him. The trust wasn't used to support her. It was used to shield the structure. And that distinction matters. Daniel pointed to the agreement again. The reason this authority was reactivated, he said, is because it allowed money to move without triggering external review. No committees, no waiting periods, no questions from institutions that don't care about family narratives. Just control. He didn't need to say the next part out loud. If the trust collapsed under scrutiny, it wouldn't just be Lena answering questions. It would be everyone whose name was attached to it, including me. That's when the weight shifted. This wasn't about me being overlooked. It was about me being used as cover. My silence hadn't been interpreted as trust. It had been interpreted as consent. Daniel closed the folder and looked at me directly. "If you do nothing," he said, "you're complicit. Not morally, legally. Silence. In this case, wasn't neutral. It was protective. Protective of them. That was the coldest part. Not that something illegal had happened, but that everything had been arranged so it wouldn't look illegal at all. Documents had been activated, not forged. Authority had been reused, not invented. Language had been chosen carefully. No one broke the law. They just bent it around a problem until it disappeared. And the problem was my sister's exposure. The money wasn't taken because she was loved more. It was taken because she was a liability, and liabilities get managed. Daniel stood up and walked to the whiteboard on the wall. He drew a simple box. "This is the trust," he said. Then he drew arrows moving out of it. Every arrow here represents risk being moved away from one person and redistributed. He pointed at the last arrow. "This one ends with you. Because I was stable. Because I was quiet. Because no one expected me to push back." That's when I realized why no one had warned me. Warnings create records. Records create exposure. They needed this to look clean. They needed me to stay exactly where I was. Daniel capped his marker and said something else that stayed with me. People don't steal like this unless they're running out of options. That sentence reframed everything. This wasn't a long-term plan. It was a response. Something had already gone wrong. The trust wasn't the source of the problem. It was the tool being used to hide it. I asked him one question. "If I step aside," I said, "what happens?" He didn't hesitate. "The system corrects itself," he said, "and it won't be gentle." I nodded once, because at that point, the decision wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. I wasn't choosing between family members. I was choosing whether I would continue absorbing risk that wasn't mine, whether I would keep being the quiet endpoint of other people's mistakes. Daniel gathered the documents back into the folder. "We can proceed," he said. "But understand this. Once this starts, it doesn't stop halfway." I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. Before we left the room, he added one last thing. "This was never about who your father loved more." He paused. It was about who he thought would never say no. And in that moment, the silence I had kept for years changed its meaning. It wasn't protection anymore. It was leverage. And I was done letting it work against me. 2 weeks later, nothing exploded. No shouting, no angry phone calls, no dramatic confrontations in the living room. What happened instead was quieter. Daniel filed one document. Just one. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a notice. A clause buried deep inside an old joint operating agreement, one I hadn't even known existed until Daniel pointed it out, had finally been triggered. An ethics provision, the kind people skim past because they assume it will never apply to them. That clause didn't require my permission. It didn't need a vote. It didn't care about intent or excuses. It cared about patterns. Once a beneficiary with controlling authority was linked indirectly to financial misrepresentation, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It escalated. Automatically, I didn't call my father to warn him. I didn't call my sister. I didn't post anything. I didn't hint. I didn't ask for explanations. I went to work. I paid my bills. I answered emails that had nothing to do with my last name. 3 days after the filing, the first letter arrived. Not to me. To the trust's registered address. A request for clarification. Neutral language, no blame, just questions. Then another letter. Then a request for records. And then, quietly, oversight shifted. This is the part people misunderstand about systems. They don't move emotionally. They don't rush. They don't accuse first. They observe. Accounts were flagged. Transfers were reviewed. Timelines were reconstructed without commentary. No one knocked on my door, but I could feel the temperature change because suddenly, the people who had always spoken with certainty started asking questions, careful ones. What year was that amendment signed again? Who authorized the reactivation? Why did this transfer bypass the usual threshold? Questions that don't sound dangerous until you realize they're irreversible. Once they're asked, they exist. My father called me that evening, for the first time in weeks. He didn't ask how I was. He asked if I'd heard anything unusual. I told him the truth. I've been busy. That wasn't sarcasm. It was accuracy. The next morning, Daniel forwarded me an update. Federal auditors had been assigned. Not because anyone had screamed fraud, because the paper trail pointed there. That's how real accountability works. Not through confrontation. Through escalation, you can't negotiate with... My sister texted me, just one message. Do you know what's going on? I read it. I didn't respond. Silence. At this point, wasn't punishment. It was policy. The audit didn't move fast. It moved thoroughly. Every assumption was tested. Every authorization was verified. Every temporary decision was examined as permanent. What became clear, very quickly, was this. The trust hadn't been misused once. It had been leaned on, over and over. Each time just enough to avoid attention, until it couldn't anymore. The system didn't care who meant well. It cared who benefited. It didn't ask who was trying to help family. It asked who absorbed risk that didn't belong to them. My name appeared in the documents more than once. Not as an actor, as a buffer. That mattered, because buffers become evidence. A week later, Daniel called me. It's moving, he said. That was all. I didn't ask him to elaborate, because at this stage, details weren't empowering. Distance was. What struck me most during those weeks wasn't fear. It was how quickly the narrative changed when emotions stopped being the currency. There were no speeches about love, no appeals to loyalty, no reminders of everything we've done for you. Those only work when someone still believes this is a family argument. The moment it becomes a structural issue, those words lose their leverage. The system doesn't care who raised you, it cares who signed. It doesn't care about intention. It cares about outcome, and it doesn't care how uncomfortable the truth makes people. It corrects anyway. One afternoon, I sat at my desk and realized something that surprised me. I felt calm, not relieved, not victorious. Calm. Because for the first time, I wasn't holding anything together. I wasn't mediating. I wasn't translating. I wasn't stabilizing someone else's mess with my silence. The system was doing what it was built to do, and I was finally doing nothing. That's the part no one warns you about. When you step back, the truth doesn't rush in dramatically. It arrives in envelopes, in timestamps, in adjustments that don't ask how you feel. My father stopped calling. My sister stopped texting. Not out of anger, out of uncertainty, because the rules had changed, and none of us controlled them anymore. Daniel sent one final message that week. From here on, he wrote, "This resolves itself." He was right, because systems don't argue, they don't forgive, they don't need closure, they just rebalance. And once that process starts, no amount of explaining can stop it. I didn't win because I was smarter. I didn't win because I was tougher. I won because I waited long enough for the truth to become undeniable. And when the system finally spoke, it didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. Everything that followed was already written. For a long time, I carried a quiet fear that if I protected myself, I would become the villain in someone else's story. That drawing a line would turn me into the cold one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who chose money over family. I let that fear keep me in place longer than I should have. But here's what I learned. Self-defense doesn't look like revenge. Revenge is loud. It wants witnesses. It wants pain to be seen and acknowledged. What I did was smaller than that. I stopped signing. I stopped fixing. I stopped absorbing consequences that weren't mine. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't try to correct anyone's version of events. I simply stepped out of a role I was never meant to play forever. And that choice didn't make me cruel. It made me accurate. There's a difference between harming someone and refusing to be used by them. One is aggression. The other is boundaries. For years, I confused the two because I was taught that endurance was virtue, that if I could carry more, I should, that if I could smooth things over, I was responsible to do it. But responsibility has limits, and when those limits are ignored long enough, silence becomes complicity. Walking away wasn't an attack. It was a correction. I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine. I didn't sabotage anyone's future. I didn't celebrate anyone's downfall. I just declined to keep holding a structure together that required my quiet sacrifice to function. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. If you've ever stayed because you didn't want to be seen as the bad one, hear this. You are not required to set yourself on fire to prove your goodness. Protecting yourself doesn't rewrite your character, it reveals it. And sometimes, the most ethical choice you can make is the one that feels least dramatic, the one where you don't fight. You simply leave the position that was costing you your life, one piece at a time. There's something no one tells you about doing the right thing. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't come with closure, or gratitude, or a neat moment where everyone suddenly understands. Most of the time, it comes with silence and misunderstanding. For a while after everything shifted, I noticed the absence first. No more invitations, no more updates passed along just in case, no one checking in to see how I was holding up. That wasn't an accident. When a system corrects itself, it disrupts comfort. And people don't thank you for disrupting comfort. They distance themselves from it. I used to believe that justice meant restoration, that if things were made right, relationships would heal, that truth would bring people closer. That's a comforting story. It's also rarely true. Justice doesn't exist to make people feel good. It exists to put weight back where it belongs. And when weight is redistributed, someone always feels lighter and someone else feels exposed. What surprised me wasn't that I wasn't celebrated. It was how quickly the focus shifted away from what happened and on to how it looked. I heard phrases through the grapevine. Did it really have to go that far? Couldn't this have been handled privately? Families work things out. Those questions weren't about ethics. They were about inconvenience. Because harmony, when it's built on silence, feels peaceful to the people benefiting from it. Until it doesn't. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Doing the right thing often makes you less likable. Not because you're wrong, but because you stop playing a role others depended on. You stop cushioning consequences. You stop translating reality into something softer. You stop absorbing damage so others don't have to feel it. And when that happens, people don't see justice. They see disruption. I had to let go of the idea that I would be understood by everyone involved. That was harder than the legal process, harder than the audit, because understanding feels personal. Justice isn't. Justice is procedural. It asks one question, over and over: what actually happened? Not what was intended. Not what was meant. Not what someone hoped would be overlooked. What happened? And once that question is answered, the outcome doesn't adjust itself to spare feelings. That doesn't make it cruel. It makes it consistent. There were moments when I wondered if I should have softened things, if I should have explained myself more, if a different tone might have preserved more connection. But then I remembered something important. Clarity doesn't negotiate with discomfort. If an explanation only works when it's gentle enough not to challenge anyone, it isn't an explanation. It's permission. And I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I wasn't trying to be right. I was trying to be accurate. Accuracy has a cost. Sometimes it costs you proximity. Sometimes it costs you the illusion of unity. But it gives you something else in return. Stability. I stopped measuring my decisions by how they were received. I started measuring them by whether I could stand behind them quietly, without justification, without rehearsal, without the need to convince anyone. That's when I understood this. Justice doesn't need to be liked to be legitimate. It doesn't need consensus. It needs structure. It needs documentation. It needs boundaries that hold even when emotions run high. And it needs people willing to step back and let systems do what personal relationships can't. There's a reason we build systems in the first place. Because families, organizations, and communities all struggle with the same weakness. They confuse closeness with fairness. They confuse loyalty with exemption. They confuse peace with the absence of accountability. Justice exists to correct those confusions, even when it costs us comfort, even when it costs us approval, even when it leaves us standing alone for a while. I won't pretend that felt easy. There were days when I questioned myself. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because being disliked is lonely, and loneliness can make even solid decisions feel heavy. But heaviness isn't the same as regret. And over time, something steadier replaced the doubt. Confidence, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that doesn't require validation. the kind that lets you sleep. If you're watching this and struggling with the idea that doing the right thing might cost you relationships, let me say this clearly. That cost doesn't mean you failed. It means the structure you were holding together depended on you staying silent. And silence, eventually, becomes a lie. Justice doesn't arrive to make everyone comfortable. It arrives to restore balance. And balance, by definition, redistributes weight. Some people will never like that. That doesn't make justice wrong. It makes it complete. Leaving didn't happen all at once. It happened in steps. The first step was formal, paperwork, signatures, a quiet transfer that removed my name from responsibilities I had carried for years. I sold my interest in the trust the same way I had managed it, cleanly, documented, without drama, no speeches, no final meetings, no attempt to explain myself one last time. I didn't need permission to leave something that had already stopped being mine. What surprised me most wasn't what I lost. It was what I felt afterward. Light, not happy, not triumphant, just light. The kind of lightness that comes from no longer bracing yourself. No more checking messages for hidden obligations. No more anticipating emergencies that weren't emergencies at all, just patterns repeating. I woke up one morning and realized my calendar was empty in a way it hadn't been in years. Not empty of purpose, empty of expectation. There's a difference between running away and stepping out. Running away is reactive. It's fueled by fear. It leaves things unfinished. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. I didn't abandon a system. I completed my role in it. I stayed long enough to make sure the truth stood on its own. Long enough that the outcome didn't depend on my presence. Long enough that my absence wouldn't collapse anything real. That's how you know you're not fleeing. You're exiting. I moved to a smaller place. Not as a statement. As a choice. I bought furniture I liked instead of what made sense. I stopped justifying rest as something I'd earned after fixing everyone else's problems. For the first time, my energy belonged to me, and nothing bad happened. The world didn't fall apart. No one showed up demanding answers. No crisis required my intervention. The silence held. That was the proof. I still think about my family sometimes. Not with anger, with distance. Distance that allows clarity instead of resentment. I don't replay conversations anymore. I don't rehearse explanations in my head. I don't need them to understand. Understanding was never the requirement. Integrity was, and integrity doesn't require an audience. If you're listening to this and you're still inside something that drains you quietly, let me say this clearly. You don't owe permanence to a role that's costing you your life. You don't have to blow things up to justify leaving. You don't need to be angry enough to deserve peace. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is finish what you were carrying and then put it down. Leaving doesn't always look brave from the outside. Sometimes it looks boring. Paperwork, boundaries, a calendar that slowly fills with your own choices instead of other people's emergencies. But boring can be stable, and stable can be healing. If you've been silent for a long time, not because you had nothing to say, but because saying it would have cost you everything, you're not weak. You were calculating, and when the moment comes to step out, you'll know. Not because it feels dramatic, but because it feels final. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever carried more than your share just to keep the peace, you're not alone, and you don't have to explain your way out. Sometimes, the most honest exit is the quiet one. If you found value in this, consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And if you're still inside your own system, holding everything together in silence, remember this: leaving isn't failing, it's choosing yourself without apology.